They are Chinese, Vietnamese down in the south, but my professional relationships are up in the north. And I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Southeast Asian Linguistic Studies. So that's what I'm into. And I enjoy Vietnamese language, Vietnamese culture, and I respect Vietnamese people. And the things that I do, I want to do with due diligence because I'm making claims about their language and even the history. And I maintain, as I say, professional relationships with Vietnamese so that I try to show that kind of respect. So, okay. So what am I going to, questions to keep in mind. So this is what I'll be covering. What are the linguistic origins of Vietnamese? Of course, that's what we want to know. What are the periods of Vietnamese linguistic history? Okay, so origins and then some transition. How did Vietnamese develop its modern linguistic traits? Okay, so we're talking about the periods and what happened during that time, and what data and methods do we need to answer these questions? And how can we evaluate these hypotheses? Ooh, that's the important one. It's fine to be able to make up a hypothesis. It's another to be able to refute a hypothesis. That is actually more beneficial to exclude possibilities. And this is obviously too much information. There's not enough time to do all of this, but there I've got, a lot of publications. There are things, there's more than a century of modern linguistic research on this stuff. I can't clarify and support everything. It's huge. There's some time for questions at the end. I've got some other publications online, so that's the best I can do for introductory talk. So what's the linguistic context of Vietnamame? Right? And when I say that, I'm talking about geography. And so looking at this, it's kind of like abstract art, right? But what you're looking at, all these colors here, are the language families in the region. And those 5 language families, Austroasiatic, Tai Kadai, often called Krodai these days, Hmong-Mien, Sino-Tibetan, sometimes called Trans-Himalayan. I'm going to use Sino-Tibetan. Trans-Himalayan is used increasingly these days. And Austronesian. So obviously, that's quite a complex mixture. And we expect a complex history, language history, as a result of this. Notice in particular that Austroasiatic, the red part, is, it looks concentrated over to the east, but you can see it in these little pockets down in Malaysia, we're in Burma, Myanmar, over all the way into India. In fact, this map does not show East India, oh, that's Northeast India, but East India there. The Austroasiatic language family used to cover quite a bit more territory, and that historical records show this as well. So the other groups are the intruding languages, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but they came in later. So Austroasiatic, which Vietnamese is the oldest existing language family in the region. Okay, so Vietnamese, back to that Austroasiatic, I just want to mention there are 13 branches of Austroasiatic, 13 recognized branches of Austroasiatic, and Vietic is one of them. So Vietnamese in the Vietic branch of Austroasiatic, and this Sidwell and Alves 2022, just about to come out, paper that Paul Sidwell and I have assembled. It'll be in the Journal of Language Relationships. And here is what we have arrived at. We're not the first to do this, but we've used updated data and updated methodology. And you can see these 5 primary sub-branches within this. And if you'll look, you'll see Vietnamese up at the top, and it's not because we're putting Vietnamese up at the top, actually, it's just because of how the branching went. We could have, I suppose, put Nguyen above Vietnamese, doesn't it? That group down at the bottom, and Paul Sidwell and I have been calling this the Tabung Malian group. There are more languages in there. That is the most conservative language group, most like Austroasiatic. I'll show you what that means in a couple of minutes. But this is the group that shows us that Vietnamese is truly an Austroasiatic language. Now, others are as well. These are fairly conservative, and they have some of these archaic Austroasiatic style features. It sort of gradually becomes more innovative. And then the Viet Minh sub-branch is indeed the most innovative Again, I will show you what that means in a few minutes. So the Vietic branch, within the Vietic branch, Viet Minh is the most innovative, most Chinese-like, and then the other groups are sort of increasingly gradation towards Austroasiatic languages. Let's say, for example, Cambodian. Okay, so these are more like Cambodian, and this is more like Cantonese, for example. Okay, not exactly, but I'll show you what that means, and I will make it a little more subtle distinction. It's not so simple as this might make it seem. Okay, modern Vietnamese typological profile versus conservative Vietic languages, and so where is that? Okay, so Vietnamese, as I said, is the Viet Minh, but Vietnamese really is the most Chinese-like. Both of them, you see here this CCVC template for both of them. But what you should pay attention to is that C2 medial in Vietnamese, it can only be wa and nothing else. I mean, that's as close as you get to, just CVC, which is actually most of the time what we have in Vietnamese. A lot of just CV, la or CVC type syllables. In the conservative Vietic languages, they have L and R in addition to W. It depends on the language. So it's not all of them, but that's the full range, typological range of them. So that's, again, this is more like what you expect in an Austroasiatic language, okay? Then we have these, oh, I forgot to mention that, I forgot to highlight that. What you don't see in the coda, the final there, the C3, is you don't see L and H in Vietnamese, but there is that in the conservative Vietic languages. Okay. Now we can have something like quat in Vietnamese, fan, and then you have a similar word in RM, cognate there, most likely. It could be a borrowing, but we'll just assume it's a cognate, some little fan thousands of years ago. We don't know, we'd have to check that. But looking at this word here, I think this is a good example of, it's just CV. Now there's a tone, and that tone 5 is the hoi tone, little diacritic right there. And so TR is actually one phoneme, the retroflex T, so it's tro. And if you're a northerner, you'll pronounce it as a palatal, but I'm going to use the sort of idealized version of it with the retroflex T, tro. Over here, on the other side, you see this Sac language, which has plo. And you might not be able to tell, but those are cognates, that is, tro and plo are actually from the same original form. And what's happened is that PL is collapsed into one segment. And there are many examples of this. And the H is lost, as I mentioned here, and that is manifested in the tone. We call that rephonologized. The H has become rephonologized as the tone here. That 5 indicates, again, that tone. Okay. So on that issue of suprasegmental features, Vietnamese has a basic 6-tone system with breathiness or glottalization. And you'll see that we use the term phonation later. So breathiness and glottalization. And so if you've studied Mandarin, you might have had someone teach you ma, 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 right? Well, here's the Vietnamese version. And so ma, 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 ma. And so you might have heard little bits of glottalization in what I'm doing. You might have even heard a little bit of breathiness ma there. And so we think of tones as being pitch, but there's more than pitch in tones often. And in Vietnamese, definitely. And I'll show you why that's the case as well. Okay, and so let's look at table 6 here. This is a range of these groups again, from Viet Minh to the sort of medial Bông Thum languages and then the archaic languages. And so what we have up here are these, I'm going to call them complex tone systems. And, we use the term complex tone systems. Let's call them fully developed tone systems. And so 5 or 6 or 7-way contour tones, that's crucial there. But for all of them, there is some kind of phonation as part of these tones. So it's not just clear tones, but often some of the tones are clear, some of them might have some breathiness or glottalization. as far as the archaic languages, they don't have these full tone systems. And in fact, some of them don't really have tone systems as we think of them. The closest, I think, is the ruk, mai, rem there with four-way contour phonation. But these others, they all have some kind of phonation, but there's something else, pitch alone, or what we call register. I don't have time to go into that. These are kind of incipient tone systems, but they are, again, more like our Austroasiatic languages. Okay. All right. Modern Vietnamese typological profile. Let's continue here. From the syllable to the prosodic word. All right. So in syllable, I said, well, Vietnamese is mostly monosyllabic. Okay. And let's be more specific. Monosyllabic roots. Okay. You can always put syllables together to make new words, but here the prosodic word itself really is monosyllabic. Okay, so when we say monosyllabic, and sometimes people say Chinese is monosyllabic, well, it's more complicated than that. But indeed, when we talk about the syllable with meaning, monosyllabic morphemes, basically. Here's an example, Roy, and for me. And then in the conservative languages, you see this tuku. Now that 3 there is a tone, and sesquisyllabic. You may be wondering what sesquisyllabic means. Sesquisyllabic really means polysyllabic, but the first syllable is unstressed, and the what we could sometimes call the minor syllable, and then the major syllable is not just stressed, but in this case, it has a tone, distinctive tone in this Rook language. So this is unstressed, doesn't even have a tone. This does. This is not what we're used to thinking about, right? We think of every syllable has a tone. That's not the case. And not all languages have tones on all of them, distinctive phonemic tones, all right? Oh, by the way, Goi is related to tuku, and you go, oh my gosh, how can that be? Again, this is the restructuring that's happened. We lose this this initial unstressed syllable collapsing into the K, vowel change for various reasons. The L becomes ya, and believe it or not, you can actually see basically the same tone kept in there. Look, does have these tones, but it only has 4. It's missing a category. Okay, for word formation strategies, of course they have compounding. Languages have compounding. Both have Austroasiatic, and I'm going to use AA for Austroasiatic because it's such a long word, Austroasiatic style reduplication. But Vietnamese has Chinese style bisyllabic compounding, which I will show in a couple of minutes. The conservative Asiatic languages have little bits of derivational prefixes and infixes. That's what Austroasiatic languages have. They have prefixes, prefixes and infixes, no suffixes. This is the whole language. Well, I got to be careful. The original language family does not have any suffixes. There are some in some very innovative languages, but they do not have them. Okay, so let's see. Vietnamese has a little bit of Chinese stuff and a little bit of Austroasiatic stuff. And we'll see that in a minute, in a couple of minutes. I'm not going to go through the syntax too much to say they're both subject verb object or agent verb patient. That's sometimes the terminology that's used. They're both topic comment. What Vietnamese does have is numeral classifier, which is kind of a Chinese-like pattern before nouns, but all other modifiers are after, totally different from Chinese, but totally like most Southeast Asian languages. Okay, so a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of Southeast Asian style and Austroasiatic style things. In the Vietic languages, which are conservative, they're varying positions, and I don't have time to go into that. It's not worth. It's too complicated. That's a big topic. So let's look at these onsets. I talked about Goi and Tuku, right? So let's see what that is. From complex onsets in Austroasiatic and Old Chinese to simplex onsets in Vietnamese. Right? This shows us the restructuring. Okay. Now, please note that the letter D, I'm going to use Vietnamese spelling. D is pronounced in Northern Vietnamese as Z. The G sound is G. It's a voiced velar fricative, and V is V. Again, a voiced bilabial fricative. All right. So all of these are voiced fricatives. All right. Okay. So here are some samples of Vietnamese, there's Zam as a kind of a field crab, and Zao, which is related to the Chinese Dao, but it has that Z onset. And from Proto-Austroasiatic, you have this kata. Now, I know it looks like a cluster, but this is basically that kind of sesquisyllable, right? I don't know if you've covered the sonority sequence principle, SSP, but k plus t is pretty marked, pretty typologically awkward, I might say. That's sort of simplistic terms. And often something like that will have a little schwa inside of it. So something like katam, okay? But so it's that kind of sesquisyllable. And Old Chinese has similarly been reconstructed with this kind of pre-syllable. The C here stands for any consonant, means that as Baxter as Cigar, who reconstructed this, don't know exactly what that segment was, but it's something like, it might as well be kata. And in both cases, we have z, okay? And I'll talk a little bit later, but Old Chinese means, think Han Dynasty, 2,000 years ago and before. So that's what Old Chinese is. That was the time when Vietic was in contact with Sinitic. Okay. Now, here's another example with bear and liver here, go and gan. And again, so here we have that kind of sesquisyllable, and we have that voiced velar fricative over here, sika, and we have again that voiced velar fricative. It was borrowed 2 times into Vietnamese. These are doublets, and so this is the older one, borrowed, maybe 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, something like that. Probably was borrowed with the meaning of sword or something like that. It means knife now. It changed over time. Liver here, you can see it's been borrowed more than once, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But again, this consistency, velar, 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 alveolar, 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 and then lime, meaning the mineral, and yellow or gold, or voy and vang. Again, we see something that's a kind of labial sound here with this sesquisyllable. And then here's the velar right here, the wa, that little kind of glide. If you know Chinese, you go huang, and the wa there, vang. Okay, so this is one of the examples that borrowed these words, but keep in mind, it borrowed these words from Chinese when Chinese had sesquisyllables, not monosyllabic. If it were borrowed when it were monosyllabic, it would have these sounds, and it did later. These are borrowed in the period when these were completely monosyllabic, da, ka, and hua, and not va, okay? All right, you got the handout. This is complicated, but this is what's happening. Oh, by the way, these kinds of sesquisyllables are shown to have existed in textual data in Vietnamese into the 2nd millennium, not the 1st millennium CE, the 2nd millennium CE. So Vietic and Viet Minh appears to have had some number of words which were sesquisyllables. It didn't become Chinese, poof, suddenly. That's not what happened. It took many centuries, maybe 1,000 years even, to become more like Chinese. Okay, Austroasiatic style reduplication. Let's see what time is it. Okay. The kind of reduplication in Austroasiatic, I sometimes call it alternating reduplication, which sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but some segments copy, some are copied, and some alternate. That's what happens, okay? It's not like Indonesian, you say buku is book, and buku buku, you reduplicate it completely, and then it becomes, plural, has a plural meaning. These are samples here, okay? And you can see here that something like bong for meaning butterfly. All of the words here are butterfly in these languages. And by the way, this Bahnaric and Katuic and Khmer, really Khmeric, but Khmer, Khmuic, all of these are Austroasiatic branches. There are more. The whole list has 9 sub-branches, and all of them have some reduplication with this word butterfly. They're not all cognate either, though, right? You can see they're different forms, and yet they are all this kind of alternating reduplication. Here's one, rak-ral, and you can see that it's copied the first two segments, the RA or the CV basically, but the codas have alternated. In this Katuic language, that way, that kind of looks like that Bahnaric one up at the top. So looks like, and these are neighboring languages. They're in a similar region. It could be contact, but still, it's an Austroasiatic style thing. Weak walk. And so it's a little, that reminds me of English flip-flop or hip-hop, right? And so we do that too, alternating the vowels inside. For Khmer, plot plot, and you can see this alliteration, right? Copying the onset clusters, but alternating other parts of it. So there's rhyming. So we've seen alternate, we've seen alliteration, rhyming, other kinds of things. It's quite rich. In Vietic, okay? And here are some of the conservative languages there, like Tabun, Bing Bok. Doesn't look exactly like the Bong Put, but it's not too far. But you can see, again, this has alliteration, right? In Vietnamese there, boom, boom. And so boom, boom is, you can see that all of the consonants and vowels have been copied, but what you notice there, that little tiny diacritic is the tone. So this is level, boom, and then boom. And so it alternates in its tone. Okay? And Vietnamese has thousands of these kinds of words. I've got a dictionary on my shelf behind me with, I don't know the exact number, 2,000 to 3,000 of these kinds of alternating reduplicants. There's a term for it in Vietnamese, and it's very much a rich part of the Vietnamese lexicon. Okay, let's jump to Chinese style bisyllabic compounds. And for those of you in the audience who might have studied Chinese, Korean, or Japanese, you will recognize these kinds of words. So you've got two Chinese characters, your Hanzi, Hanja, Kanji, and in Vietnamese, Han Tu. And so just look at that first one, university, Vietnamese Dai Học. Basically, the big study, sort of, if you go literally, what I mean, Dai Học. Now, if you look at Mandarin Daxue, that doesn't seem like it resembles it. So Cantonese is Dai Học. There are lots of southern varieties of Chinese which have a closer pronunciation than Mandarin does. And then Dai Học and Dai Gaku. And so all of these are not from 2,000 or 1,000 years ago. These words, many of them, or at least they were spread throughout these languages, from Chinese mostly, but sometimes from Japanese, coining the terms, into Korean, into Vietnamese, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And these are therefore not this kind of Chinese style bisyllabic compounding word formation, wordful, that's not so ancient in Vietnamese. Vietnamese has the long tradition, literary tradition of Chinese writing, just as Korean and Japanese does, okay, which means it's effectively part of the East Asian literary tradition, even though you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at most universities that say East Asian don't include Vietnamese, but they should. But this shows you that. So both Chinese style and Vietnamese, Austroasiatic style are in Vietnamese. So, okay, I'm going to jump into some more big topic issues. And before I get to that, I want you to mention my sources of data, right? We're talking about origins and development and such. These days, we have huge amounts of lexical data, databases, tools for searching through this data that we did not have 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. Okay, for people who are into historical linguistics, now is in Southeast Asia and East Asia, it is a fantastic time because you can check, there are all kinds of huge amounts of data, powerful tools for searching through them, okay? So when I'm talking about things, I am using these as much as I can, absolutely. As I said, I've got to do due diligence and use these and not look at like two languages and say, aha, look at those two languages, they share a word. I'm looking at potentially hundreds of languages, okay? And this is what you need to do as well if you're going to do it effectively and properly and really make progress and do it responsibly for the people whose language it is. Okay, textual data, obviously. Lots of stuff for Chinese nowadays. For those of you who might know Chinese, you've probably seen lots of ancient Chinese texts online. You can search through them. Vietnamese Nome, Old Khmer, all kinds of things. Huge numbers of publications of descriptions of the languages in the region. Again, there have been some. There were plenty in the 20th century, but growing numbers in the last few decades. We must, of course, use the comparative method, historical phonology for all of these language groups, etymology, lexical semantics and semantic domains, diachronic syntax. It's lots of questions. It's hard to answer all of them. And if you are going to do any real historical linguistics, not just diachronic linguistics, which is, things change from this period to this period, but we don't know when. If you want to really dig deep into historical linguistics, you need historical information, archaeological information, ethnographic information. And that's what I've been doing the last decade increasingly. And it's very rich, but it's also very tough. And you've got to coordinate with historians and archaeologists to make sure that you're making the right understanding things in the right way. So here's some caveats. The things I'm about to talk about, there are gaps in the data. There's still need for additional data. As I mentioned when I showed you that very multicolored map of all those language, it's complex history of language contact, phonological reduction, as I've just shown you in Vietnamese, not just Vietnamese. There's been phonological reduction in many of the languages in the region. Typological convergence, the languages become similar to each other, the Southeast Asian Sprachbund or language area, if you've not heard the term. And there's just chance similarity. Sometimes words look similar. Now, having said that, I have done my due diligence. I've checked these sources as much as I can, and I'm continuing to. So let me move on here. So tentative stages from Austroasiatic to modern Vietnamese. Okay, so the origins are Austroasiatic, yes. Austroasiatic dispersal. Archaeologists have been describing now what's called the Neolithic agriculturalists, and there is very strong growing evidence of about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BCE, of peoples moving from around northern Vietnam, bordering southern China, spreading into mainland Southeast Asia. And what we have from our reconstructions is that Austroasiatic was this polysyllabic, and I should say sesquisyllabic, and non-tonal. Vietic, as a distinct group, we cannot know exactly when it became a distinct group. And there's not really a way to do it. I put 1000 BCE here because, again, in the archaeological record, in northern Vietnam, that was the beginning of the Bronze Age. And I figure 1,000 years after the dispersal and a period in which people are in contact to, cultures change when they enter the Metal Age. And so this is my kind of place-holding hypothesis, all right? I think it's a reasonable one, but it's non-disprovable. I can't prove or disprove it, really. Polysyllabic, non-tonal, maybe phonation. We don't know. There's some hypotheses by Gerard de Floth on this matter, and it's still being discussed. So then we have our heavy Sinitic Vietic contact, and I'm not going to say Sino-Vietnamese because there was no Vietnamese 2,000 years ago, okay? It was Vietic, maybe early Vietnam, we don't know that, but it's just not Vietnamese. It wasn't what it is today, right? And even for Chinese, I could say Old Chinese, but I'll just say Sinitic, okay? At that point, in fact, both Sinitic and Vietic were polysyllabic and non-tonal. That might come as a shock to you, but there's a growing body of evidence, at least that it was non-tonal. That's generally agreed. That Old Chinese had pre-syllables, well, that's like other Sino-Tibetan languages. So it's a natural hypothesis. It can be debated, but there's a good deal of evidence for this. Viet Minh, I hypothesize, about 1,000 years ago, that's when the Han, sorry, the Han peoples, the Chinese administration had ended. There was still some polysyllabicity, but I'm assuming the hypothesis is there were tones at that period. Then we go into Vietnamese and we can divide the stages basically in the second millennium, okay? And archaic to middle to modern Vietnamese, reduced polysyllabicity, increasing the tones. The initial clusters lasted into the 1800s. So polysyllabicity into the second millennium and initial clusters. This is Vu Duc Nhiêu, Vietnamese scholars have published on this recently, showing very good evidence of even written evidence, Roman alphabet evidence of these kinds of clusters. So this is very strongly supported. So what we see in Vietnamese today, even 200 years ago, it had more complex initial clusters, such as ML. Ooh, that's kind of an odd cluster to an English speaker, right? Mla. But there's good evidence for this. Okay, so those are the stages, and I've combined them a little bit with archaeological, textual, historical stuff with the linguistic information we have. Okay. Now we can do a little semantic domain. Well, sorry, the little bit of etymological research here. And what you're looking at are about 850 something reconstructed Vietnamese words. Reconstructed Vietic words that are also in Vietnamese. And what you see here is that the vast majority of these are native. Okay, and so 60% meaning, connected to Proto-Vietic. I should have put Proto-Vietic here, but it's Vietic, that's fine. Proto-Austroasiatic or neighboring Austroasiatic groups. Okay, so maybe not all the way to Proto-Austroasiatic 4,000 years ago, but something that they were in contact with these other groups. These Chinese and even Dai forms can be reconstructed. It doesn't mean that they go back to Proto-Vietic. It just means that they are ancient and widespread. And so, they're fairly modest, but they're there. Okay. People shoot out the number sometimes, 70% Vietnamese vocabulary, 70% Chinese. Well, actually some Vietnamese scholars who have been checking, lexicographers have been checking this more carefully. The number they get is about maybe up to 40% or less. Okay, so that number 70% has never been shown with data. People with data recently, Vietnamese linguists have suggested a smaller number. And this shows that Vietnamese has a solid core of native vocabulary. Lots of thousands of Chinese loanwords in recent years, especially in the 20th century. Semantic domains. Now, these kinds of words of the Vietic and Austroasiatic etymology, look at these semantic domains, and you see lots of vocabulary here, right? We can see, oh, sure, lots of basic vocabulary, animals and basic actions and parts of the body, those kinds of things. That's what we expect. That's fine. That's useful for historical phonology. But we can look at words related to the house, clothing and grooming, kinship. These kinds of words tell us a little bit more about early Vietic culture. Agriculture and vegetation, the agriculture part is also significant, as I am about to show you. So this is the kind of thing we can do when we're looking at semantic domains of proto-language forms or reconstructed forms. So I'm going to focus on rice agriculture. Okay. Now, just in case you didn't know, rice is just a little bit important in Asian cultures, right? And it is certainly important for understanding, agriculture in general is very important for understanding, for archaeologists and ethnohistorians, for understanding how people spread and that sort of thing. And so when we look at the Proto-Vietic words related to rice agriculture, we see here, here's some forms here, this glutinous of rice and millet, and so millet's not rice, but another kind of grain, and rice field and these sorts of things. And go, oh, okay, this is good because this shows us something about what Vedic people were doing and eating perhaps a few thousand years ago, undoubtedly before the Chinese administrations expanded into this region. And it matches the archaeological evidence of rice production and millet production. In fact, some of these words here, such as husked rice, winnowing basket, seedlings, can be reconstructed in Proto-Austroasiatic. Again, I just said before, that's about 4,000 years ago. If my linguistic data is valid, then this means that these kinds of words were spoken by Proto-Austroasiatic speakers and Vedic speakers at least 4,000 years ago, and most likely before. And so this is a big debate. The history of rice production in the region, all kinds of archaeological publications on this stuff. I've got a little bit of linguistic data to contribute to that discussion. I communicate with archaeologists, so hopefully they'll pick up a little bit more, because I think this is useful. Okay, and not just me. Multiple layers of Chinese loanwords. All right, let's get back to Chinese. We talked about the native stuff. Chinese loanwords and these early Chinese loanwords and literary Sino-Vietnamese. When I say early Chinese loanwords, I mean the first several centuries of the first millennium CE, and literary Sino-Vietnamese from about 1,000 years ago. And so early Chinese loanwords, borrowed centuries before the Sino-Vietnamese layer from the Han Dynasty, about 2,000 years ago, and several centuries onward. There are some additional subperiods within this era. So obviously what I just gave you in one bullet would take, hours to cover. Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary are Hanzi, that's the kanji hanja. Chinese character readings in Vietnamese stemming to late Middle Chinese, so about 1,000 years ago. Now, I have to say one thing briefly. At your university there, you've got a professor named John Pham, who has published very useful and significant work on with a hypothesis that there was a large Chinese population. And you may just assume that, but that's not actually clearly shown in the record, that there was a large bilingual Chinese and Vietnamese, or I should say Vietnam population. This is what allows this kind of vocabulary to be brought into Vietnamese with the tones very consistently. Obviously, Korean and Japanese does not have tones, so you can't really know anything about it, but the consistency of the tones of these Chinese character readings are such that there had to have been a good-sized Chinese bilingual population, both before and into this period. But they are no longer there. They shifted to, the hypothesis is that they shifted to Vietnam. Okay, again, what I just talked about in about 90 seconds takes a book, read a book about it. Recent era, Chinese style compounds, as I discussed, Chinese dialect loanwords like Cantonese cuisine words and that sort of thing. Okay, the current hypothesis here is that this large Chinese-speaking population lived in northern Vietnam into the early second millennium CE and then shifted to Vietnam. Ooh, lots of information. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at this. Early Chinese language. So yeah, I'm in slide, oh, hold on, let me just check here. Oh yeah, got about 5 more slides, so we're good. Okay, early Chinese loanwords, that is before late Middle Chinese, and then Sino-Vietnamese from late Middle Chinese, later Middle Chinese. Take a look here. These are the kinds of categories, trade items, materials, actions, the concepts, literacy, and kinship. You can see that these kinds of words are, I think, reasonably representative of Chinese culture and the aspects that we expect of a Chinese culture. So of course, chopsticks, good. In the later period, the Sino-Vietnamese popper, we have this bag, okay, fine. Notice how room is in here twice, buong and phong. Buong is just the early Chinese loan word. So it's got a different, different phonemes there. Phong as being the actual character reading. So the SV here stands for Sino-Vietnamese, which means that's the character reading. So ja here is the reading of this character. I think in Japanese it's hashi, I think, or is it hashi? I can't remember. Anyways, chopsticks here. Materials such as silver and gold, as I was mentioning before. in that early period, but also jade and incense in somewhat later periods. Let's jump down to the literacy, right? We expect literacy. So we have the word for zi as jiu, this one here, but there's also this th. And so we have these doublets, all of these are doublets, right? We have the word book here, pen, and this, so you can see what's going on. Oh, and kinship terms too. We have the kinship terms. So, ooh, now this again, this kind of borrowing is not just the evidence of trade, but of most likely a bilingual community and intermarriage. That's not, there's way more than this. This is just a snapshot, a select list, okay? But both the earlier period and somewhat later period. And not the 19th or 20th century. These are borrowed maybe 1,000 years ago. Something. I don't know. I don't have exact dates. I shouldn't say that. Okay. Speaking of tones. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. I didn't speak of tones. Let me see if I can find that. Notice how this one has this little curly tone. That's the nga tone. And then this one has this little dot at the bottom. That's the na tone. Okay, two different tones for that. You go, well, how can those be related? But look up here, lun and luan. Oh, you see the same pattern. And dua and cha. Oh my goodness, I think I see a pattern, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, indeed, there is. And down here, it's the reverse. That little na tone versus the nga tone. Oh, okay. So if you have not seen the name Audricourt, Andre Audricourt, check it out. If you are into Asian linguistics of any kind, really, East or Southeast Asian linguistics, you'd better take a look at that name. And his hypothesis of the origin of tones in Vietnamese is sometimes called tonogenesis. Okay, he didn't use the term at the time, but later came to be called that. And we look at codas in Austroasiatic being rephonologized. I said that earlier, rephonologized as tones in Vietnamese. And so here's the way it works as per Audricourt. These are final sonorants, right? So you can see this Vietic and Austroasiatic, m and r, and it could also just be a vowel if the vowels are sonorants as well. So if it's an open kind of final. And so we have these, what we call generally level tones. I'm just going to call it category A tones. This is the high one. This is the low one. Yang, Huin. Okay. Fine. And so we see that m sonorant, the r sonorant. Okay. Here's another tone category. That was the one we were looking at before, that little curly guy. And so you see these here, the H and S fricatives, these fricative codas, okay? And again, we have a kind of a higher one and a lower one, although in Vietnamese, this one actually feels kind of lower than this one now, but there are complex reasons. Tones change over time in various ways. So high, yeah, yeah, and muy. And so the next tone category, so and notice how Vietnamese does not have H or S final. So these were lost and those were rephonologized, okay? And then these last category here of C and D, I'm grouping them together because they are voiceless stops. And in this case, there's a final glottal stop, which is lost in Vietnamese. There is no final glottal stop in Vietnamese, okay? But instead we just have the tone. But when it's a K or ka, cha, ta, ka, or sorry, pa, ta, cha, ka, PT, palatal cha, or ka, we have this sa or na tones, okay? And notice if you don't have to be very clever to notice that I didn't put a C2 here. Well, let's see if we can find some by looking at Old Chinese. It's because there's a little gap in the data. That's the way it is. From Old Chinese codas to Vietnamese tones. So this is what Audricourt also noted. It matches Old Chinese. Now, he did not have the reconstructions we have today, but he had enough that he knew that these sonorants lead to the A category tone, these sonorant finals, like this nasal or this glide. These fricatives, final fricatives led to these curly looking tones here, the B category tones, and then these final voiceless stops. So whether they were final glottal stops or pa, cha, ta, ka, well, there's no cha in Old Chinese, only pa, ta, ka. these become these sak and non-tones. And so by the way, I haven't covered why they are different height. It just has to do with onset voicing, and I don't have time. Okay, your brain may explode if I go into too much. Well, by the way, if you happen to know Mandarin, you'll see the tones right here. Lian, chui, tu, yi, o, ran, la, ni. And so, okay. But Mandarin, of course, doesn't have these ba, da, ga finals. Cantonese does. Lots of Southern Chinese varieties do, not just Cantonese. Dozens and dozens and dozens of varieties of Chinese have in the South. Okay, so we've got both Austroasiatic source words and Chinese, and because this happened after Chinese was before Chinese had tones, these were borrowed with these segments, not with tones. The later period, these were borrowed, the later Sino-Vietnamese ones were borrowed with tones. These were borrowed before tonogenesis in Chinese or Vietnamese. That may be that's a lot of information to process. Anyways, that's the hypothesis. There's a lot of data for this now. It's not absolutely perfect, but it is very strong, so much so that it's hard for people, I would say, to argue that I don't think there's convincing evidence otherwise. Okay, so answers to the starting questions. It's almost done. Answers to the starting questions. Origins. Vietnamese is an Austroasiatic language that has experienced long-term language contact with and influence from Semitic, even while Semitic itself underwent restructuring, as I have mentioned at various times. Vietnamese language history includes contact with other Southeast Asian languages, both Dai and other Austroasiatic languages. There were little bits in the information I've shared that show that, right? Stages. We can trace Vietnamese back to Proto-Viet Minh, that's the most innovative sub-branch of Vietic, back to Proto-Vietic, and ultimately Proto-Austroasiatic, about 4000 BC. Now, when I say this, I should have said the dispersal, the Proto-Austroasiatic dispersal. We can't really know how old a language family is, but we can say that Proto-Austroasiatic dispersed about 4,000 years before present. Archaeological notation there. Traits. Vietnamese has words and structural features connected to Austroasiatic, Semitic, and the larger Southeast Asian Sprachbund. That's our language area. Okay, so complex situation. I think I've shown a good deal of this. How did this happen? Vietnamese linguistic traits are partly retentions of Austroasiatic origins, partly contact convergence with Chinese and neighboring languages in mainland Southeast Asia at different times in different ways. However, some changes took many centuries. So we must view some changes as typological tendencies, that is not necessarily due to contact, in addition to language contact. So as I mentioned, those pre-syllables in Viet Minh lasted into the second millennium. Now, how many, we don't know. How many words, they're not a huge number in the evidence, but I don't know, there's some 20 something words that have evidence in Vietnamese texts with these pre-syllables. And the clusters, as I mentioned, they lasted into the early 1800s. So that's long after Chinese population was not so influential. How can we know this? Well, we have large quantities of comparative data and a growing body of archaeohistorical data. And these can be combined and suggest that these hypothesized historical linguistic scenarios. And so these are my references in the handout. And I believe that's what I have to do. I've used up my 50 something minutes. And so I hope you survived. Stop sharing. And I better stop the recording here.